guys, I'm Seryna Myers, and I'm one of those weird people who has no problem with having super awkward, uncomfortable conversations. It's what I do for a living, and I help other people do the same, in particular, people pleasers who have a really hard time saying anything that's going to make anybody uncomfortable, and in doing so, they really deny honoring themselves and what they need and how they feel. So that's what I do. I teach people pleasers how to get raw, real, and honest about what it is that they're feeling so that they can get out and make some magic in the world instead of holding themselves back. So today I want to talk about the three most common ways people, not just people pleasers, but people, the modern day human, avoids dealing with their anger. And I don't want to just be a bummer about it and say, like, this is what you're doing, because that's totally not my approach at all. We're going to talk about what these traps are. And they are traps, they are bad habits that we fall into and things that unconsciously we create as barriers instead of just being with ourselves and honoring what we feel and even giving ourselves the time to do that. I'm going to talk about what those three top things are, but I'm also going to give you some suggestions of things that you can do instead. And like most of my work, what I'm going to tell you is super simple, not necessarily easy, but easy to follow. And so we're going to get into that right now. And of course, if this is something that you're currently having a hard time with, you are absolutely welcome to take a look at my website and see the programs that I offer. I have a beautiful one-on-one program that is specifically designed to help people work with their anger, understand what's going on and how they can carry themselves in the world in a way that doesn't feel bound and repressed and held on to. And so if that's something that you need some help with, then we should definitely talk. Okay, so the first thing that we do, I always like to refer to this as where we keep ourselves like numbed out. And oftentimes the one that's the most common is going to be where we're binge watching shows. So if you're someone who has hung out with your TV long enough that Netflix pops up and says, are you still watching? This is probably a message for you. There's going to come a time and place where you're not going to want to be able to dig into what you're feeling. Sometimes we just actually need to get by, and we do have to choose to numb out to be able to get by in a particular situation, and we can deal with it later. And I've talked about this before, but sometimes what ends up happening is we say that we're going to do this. We're like, I'm just doing this for now. I'm checking out for now. I'm going to come back to this later. And then later doesn't come because when you're deferring doing this work, you're saying, I'm going to put off doing something that's really awkward and uncomfortable and hard. And that's not super incentivizing. So nobody really wants to go back to that. So here's what I'm going to suggest you do instead. I'm not saying give up your Netflix account. I would never in a million years ask you to do that. But if you do feel like you've got a little bit of emotional energy where you can actually just be with your feelings, not even necessarily the big ones, but just about how you're feeling about the day-to-day stuff or the stresses in your life or how you're feeling being a human during a pandemic, because holy man, has that ever been a big deal for us in the last year. So whatever it is that's coming up for you, I would love if you took even just one of the time you invest in one of those episodes to be with yourself, to reflect. For some people, it's going to be sitting down and journaling. For other people, they're going to want to dance it out. They're just going to like feel it physically through their body. Someone else might want to just meditate, where it's actually not so much being with the thoughts and feelings, but giving them space to be able to move through you. I'm not going to tell you the way that you need to do this because everybody has such a unique approach to this. And of course, I can give you a million suggestions, but it's really important that we find ways where we can be with ourselves, where we can make time and space to really just listen to what's going on. Because honestly, it can get super, super busy up here. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with like the bigger part of my story, but a few years ago, I had some very debilitating anxiety. I spent like 10 months in bed, and it was all consuming. It was really hard. And I was always someone who was really strong, really resilient. I was the one that everybody came to with their problems. And when I sat in this space of being completely not myself, I couldn't figure out how I'd gotten there. And a huge part of that is that I kept deferring these emotions. I kept deferring these big things, these issues that really needed tending to, and I just didn't have the bandwidth for it. And any time that I did have to myself, I spent on Netflix or scrolling my phone on social media or any of those things where I could just kind of mentally check out a little bit. And these are really crappy habits that we get into, especially if we're not going to then make the time to go back to those issues because they do pile up. I always think of it as like whenever you see the cartoons where someone has shoved too many things in the closet door and then one day somebody doesn't realize it, they open the door and everything comes falling down. That's what happens when we defer dealing with how we feel, particularly with uncomfortable emotions. And it doesn't have to be that way. We just need to be able to treat it almost like it's not even like it's discipline. We almost have to treat it like it's hygiene or habits that are really good to have, where, you're going to give yourself like half an hour a day where you can just be with your thoughts and feelings. Okay, so number one is that we stay numbed out, typically with something like TV or social media. Number two is we keep ourselves overscheduled. And sometimes it's our own things, sometimes it's our kids or our spouses, and we're managing a whole bunch of different people's social calendars. And here's what I want to know because we've all been at home for the last year, and I still know so many people, usually women, who are doing this, who are sacrificing their own needs and their own space that they need to take up to even give themselves that 30 minutes that I talked about with Netflix. They are just keeping life so friggin' busy that they don't have the time, literally, like there's no time for themselves. But we are in a pandemic. We're not going anywhere. So all of these things, like the commitments that we're living in right now, we're actually in a really cool era because last year we saw all the social constructs come down across the entire world. It wasn't like it was just one city, one country that had this weird experience. Globally, everything changed and we stopped having the expectations to be, do, want, have in the way that we were, in the way that capitalist society had taught us to be, the way that our conditioning had taught us to be. And so now we have this opportunity to reinvent ourselves and to reprioritize everything. And so many of us just said, how can I just make this the same old, same old? How can I get back to normal instead of using this as an opportunity to create a new normal, which includes time and space for you, for your feelings? Now, here's the suggestion that I have for this. And it's not going to be a cozy one because it's going to include something you need to do for yourself. You need to learn to say no. And you also need to learn to say no to yourself. Because the majority of people that I work with are people pleasers, and they want to make sure that everyone else is taken care of and that everybody else is happy and that everyone else's needs are met, and they do this at their own expense. And so in saying no and reprioritizing that time and that energy into something for yourself, you're going to feel guilty and you're going to feel selfish and you're going to feel maybe even undeserving or unworthy of that. And that's going to be pretty confronting. And like I said before about how we put away and we delay facing with our stuff, and so we don't actually go back to it. I mean, we end up in the same place. Here I am saying, stop doing something that feels good, because people pleasers, even though we've got like resentment and stuff that can build up over time, ultimately helping people feels good. It's why we do it. So what I'm saying is have these boundaries, say no, and then reprioritize that time for yourself. That saying no is super uncomfortable. That's the stuff that, people want to avoid. So I realize that what I'm saying is take away time from something that feels good to do something that doesn't feel good. But the more you do it, the easier it's going to get. And so then saying no and prioritizing yourself doesn't feel as shitty. And not only that, but you start to actually really enjoy having these pockets of time that are entirely for you. And you can, ideally, you're going to use them to be honest with yourself about what you're feeling and what's coming up for you. But maybe it's just going for a walk. Maybe it's just, I don't know, putting your feet in the water. Like maybe it's something really simple that brings a lot of presence and a lot of awareness into a particular moment, but doesn't have like a big impact overall. But that tiny little juicy, delicious moment is entirely for you. And like, how amazing is that? Okay. So the first part is giving up some of our tech time to be able to redirect and reschedule that time into reflective practices like journaling or art or dance or meditation or whatever. The second part is by looking at where we're giving all of our time away and reclaiming some of it for ourselves, saying no to all our overcommitments, and using that time for something really beautiful and delicious and reflective for ourselves again. The third part is probably the biggest one, and this is going to be the one that is also the most potentially disruptive in your life. So I want you to take a nice big deep breath before we go there. The third way that you are of avoiding talking about and experiencing how you feel is that you are avoiding having difficult conversations. Yeah. So a lot of people I know, particularly when they're angry, find that it's easier to put up and shut up than it is to deal with how somebody else might feel about their anger. A lot of people I know are uncomfortable with their own anger and they don't even know that they can constructively express it. So they bury it down until it comes out in ways that is definitely not constructive, and they have no control over it because it's been built up and pressurized for so long that it just erupts. It doesn't have to be this way. When we can start having these conversations, and much like I said before about those boundaries and saying no, the more you do it, the easier it will get. I lost my train of thought there. So the more you're doing it, the easier it's going to get. But here's the other thing. There is a little nugget that you want to do before you start just going into battle and having hard conversations with everybody. And that is taking some time to reflect on how you feel about your own worth. If you don't feel worthy and deserving of your own love, time, attention, energy, even the money that you're spending, if you're not feeling worthy of those things, it's going to be really hard for you to put boundaries in place and dedicate time to yourself and then trust the emotions that you're feeling. When someone feels unworthy, oftentimes when they have these emotions like anger or resentment or judgment or frustration, they're also simultaneously having these opposite thoughts of, well, you shouldn't feel that way because other people have it worse. It could be worse. At least it's not as bad as. And like we start to almost make excuses for these very real and human emotions that we're having. We gaslight ourselves. It's really awful. And so I'm going to invite you to do some hard work and to really be with this. And it might mean having a conversation with your inner child, because most of our worthiness stories are stemmed back in our childhood. There's all these different ways that you're able to reflect and be with this. And the more you do this work, whether it's journaling or art expression or frankly, even therapy, the more you're doing this work, the more the puzzle pieces are going to come together. Like I always think of it as almost like connect the dots, where you're like, oh, okay, that's where that comes from and how that all comes together. When we have this worthiness piece in place, that makes having that initial conversation easier. And then we can start to have more of the conversations so that it becomes second nature and it becomes really honestly like depersonalized. It's not about hot heads, it's not about big emotions. And because you're comfortable with it and you're not avoiding it, you're having conversations as the issues come up. They're not building up and blowing up. It's just a way of addressing it in the moment so that it's not something you have to deal with later. And it sounds like such a simple concept, but how many of us do it? I mean, this is like I literally wrote a book on anger and I still have moments where I build up and then blow up. But for the most part, I would say for the last like 5 years of my marriage, I've been really aware of how if I just speak up in the moment, nothing escalates. And communication is at an all-time high and everything feels really good and really supportive and everybody's on the same page. So if that's the case, then why did I say that it has the potential to be the most disruptive? Well, here's the thing. When we enter into relationships, there are certain dynamics that are in place. And I don't want to say power dynamics, but power is part of it because ideally we're all equals, but let's be honest, sometimes that ebbs and flows within relationships. And when we go through the process of claiming our worth, what we are doing is changing the dynamic. Now, you are 100% entitled to change the dynamic, but the other person is also 100% entitled to have their feelings about that too. I always like to say it's like when you got married, for instance, you sat down to play a game of Monopoly and the two of you are working on this together and you're playing and everything is going fine, or it's not fine, but you're still playing the same game. But when you go off and you do all this inner work and you come back, you put down like a game of checkers and you're like, we're playing checkers. And your partner's like, that's weird because I came into this thinking we were playing Monopoly. And you're entitled to want to play checkers and they're entitled to want to play Monopoly. And maybe it's going to mean that you like chuck both games and you decide to play the game of life and you do something completely different and reinvent yourselves and your relationship and your dynamic together. But oftentimes it means that there has to be some compromise. Maybe sometimes you're playing Monopoly and sometimes you're playing checkers. Maybe you have to find your way, but this is where it can become disruptive. And disruptive isn't necessarily bad. It just means that change is going to happen. It means that things are going to get a little bit different, and we need to be willing to grow in those ways, because that's where it happens. That's where we have progress. That's where we get to reclaim our voice and our power and show up as we want to show up, instead of just being, I don't know, like on this little like I don't know why it sounds like a rowboat and a hamster wheel at the same time. But we want to feel like we're moving forward. And if we're just like, running on that hamster wheel and we're repeating the same things and we're not having any fun, then what's the point? Something needs to change. So the homework in that little part, the little like assignment bit of what you can do instead, is to really start building up that feeling of self-worth, and recognizing how you can show up more for yourself, which is going to make everything a whole lot easier. And then you can see how that impacts the relationships of the people that you have around you. And maybe some things need to change, and maybe some people need a little bit less time and energy put into them. But when you are doing it from this place of self-love and self-worth, and not from this place of wanting to punish somebody else for feeling differently than you do, or feeling resentful or petty, then it's okay, because you're doing it from love, and you're doing it from love for yourself, and you are 100% entitled to all the love that you give to everybody else. All of this stems from us treating anger or other uncomfortable emotions like resentment and jealousy and guilt and shame and all that stuff. All of this comes from us treating those emotions as things that need to be managed. I'm a firm believer that they are a normal, and I would even go so cheekily to say an essential part of our growth. We as spiritual beings came into this life to have a human experience. And that means like interacting with people in the way that is going to bring up the entire gamut of emotions. So to only allow ourselves to experience the fun, happy, super shiny element of that scale, we are missing out on all of the richness, all of the value, all of um, the clarity that comes with those other emotions. Because those emotions might not be fun, but they are clear. They bring our priorities, our needs, our values to the surface, and they are undeniable. So what if we just like rewrite our relationship with something like anger? What if we just considered a different way of doing things? One where we're not trying to just like minimize it, get it away, deny it, and pretend it's not happening. One where we actually invite anger to the table and we're like, hey, let's have a conversation. Like, what are you here to teach me? Why have you shown up today? Why do I keep repeating this pattern? Because you keep being here and you're not like the most wanted house guest. And I can't seem to get rid of you. So can you just tell me what's up? And so because I believe so wholeheartedly that we need to be having these conversations with our anger, I've put together a free guide. I'll make sure that there's a link to it in the comments below. And it's called Conversations with Anger, and it gives you 3 different tools. It's accessible to anyone of any level experience. So if you are completely new to this game, don't worry, like this will still work for you. And it gives you 3 different tools that you can use to access the deeper levels of conversation with yourself, the deeper levels of consciousness, so that you know what's happening behind the scenes. Because maybe you're responding from anger, but you're actually feeling hurt or jealous or resentment or whatever. Maybe it's not about somebody coming home after you've made dinner. Maybe it's because they came home after you made dinner and you'd already done all these other things, and you've got like a whole laundry list of like 2,000 things that have built up over time that haven't been dealt with. So we need to talk to anger and be like, hey, why are you here? What are you here to teach me? And what do I need to do to make sure that you can get on your way? So we can process it and allow it to move through us, and also that we develop this relationship with it so that when it does come up, we're not afraid of it. We're not intimidated. We're just like, oh, it's you again. Cool. Let's have a conversation. You can tell me why you're here. So there's 3 different tools to do that. That are available to anyone of any level of experience. It's called Conversations with Anger. I'll make sure that I link that in the comments, because honestly, it is such a powerful tool to be able to get you going to rewrite this entire relationship with this emotion, which I think can totally, totally, totally transform your life. Okay, that is my 2 cents for you today, my darlings. I hope this finds you well. I will see you again soon with another little nugget. Take care.